right, so what we're going to do from this point forward is we're going to go over the basic principles of the United States government, right? There's 5 of them, okay? We have checks and balances, separation of powers, popular sovereignty, federalism, and limited government. There are five basic principles of the United States government, okay? Now, we know how each of them were supposed to play out, how each of them were supposed to be set up in the original Constitution. Basically, what did the Founding Fathers say about each of these 5 principles? And we have places to go where we can find that out, right? But the great thing about our Constitution is that it's made to change over time. We call it like a living document. It can be amended, it can be changed, it can apply throughout various periods of history. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. And when you compare it to maybe what the original intentions were of each of these principles of government, you might find that the government is not quite the same way it was supposed to be in the past, okay? So we're going to look at popular sovereignty to start with. Let me go to the next slide. So here's the steps to understanding changes to the Constitution. If you apply this principle to each of the 5, it should change your screen. If you apply this principle to each of the 5 basic principles, these 4 steps, you will follow through and make a complete before and after comparison to popular sovereignty, okay? So you could apply this to limited government, federalism, all that stuff. But let's start by looking at what were the Founding Fathers' original plan. Then we're going to look into what does the Constitution actually say, what are the words in the Constitution, and then we're going to look at what happened later in history to prompt a need for change. And finally, are there any committees or informal procedures that help clarify/solve the issue? That one is a little hit or miss. For this one, it doesn't so much apply. But for us, Supreme Court cases in this one are going to be key, okay? So let's look at the Founding Fathers' original plan.
I'm just going to follow on the words. My page isn't changing.
That's fine. So the first step, we know what the Founding Fathers actually said about each of these principles. They published a series of essays, both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, basically arguing about how the government should be set up. Well, we can look at Federalist number 39, because in Federalist number 39, James Madison kind of talks about things that are necessary for a true republic to exist. And each of those things are essentially some form of popular sovereignty, right? Quick review on this board. This picture to me represents popular sovereignty. Remember, popular sovereignty is that the authority of the governed comes from the consent of the governed, right? So that basically the people give the government its power. So that's why we got power to the people. So back over here. It says these 3 things are necessary for a republic to exist. The power to govern must be derived from the consent of the people, meaning the people must be the one who give the government its power. Nothing else, nowhere else, the people. Second, the representatives chosen by the people must be the ones who actually run the government. So you might hear in current day history, there's elections that take place in some countries, but those elections are almost just a way to please the people. When you get down to the bottom of it, really those elections are just electing people to do minor things in the government. And as a matter of fact, even the Ohio government, which is something we'll talk about later on, in the Ohio government, it was set up at one point so that the people we chose weren't really the ones who were running the government. It's kind of a unique case, if you will. But the people you choose must actually be the ones who run the government. Second, the term of service of the representatives must be limited. So the people we elect, we must limit how long they can actually be in government. It must be limited by time, good behavior, or as long as the people approve of this person. So we have term limits. We have ways to get rid of people who basically don't display good American or good behavior, period, good morals. And we also have ways to remove people from power, and that's mainly through voting, right? We can literally vote on a new person to take over at an election, all right? So, therefore, I'm going to sum up Fed 39, Madison's argument. The people are the ones who choose the people to run to the government. but the people may also decide if the person they chose is still fit to serve the government. Okay? So the population chooses the people to run the government, but at any time, the population can essentially remove that person from government through various ways. Okay? Who are the people, right? If we're going to have this idea of popular sovereignty, the idea that the people are the ones who elect the representatives, we need to understand who the actual people are. And if you guys know anything about U.S. history, you can imagine right off the bat certain people who technically didn't count as people. Women were not able to vote, didn't necessarily count as people. African Americans were not able to vote, didn't necessarily count as people under the Founding Fathers. We could even say certain ages weren't able to vote, weren't technically people yet. People who lived in very specific areas couldn't vote, which we'll talk about, okay? We need to figure out who the people are. So let's look at our second step is, what does the Constitution say on the matter? We know what the Founding Fathers said with Fed 39. Now we want to know what the Constitution says on the matter. So let's look at the Constitution. It says, only white males over the age of 21 could vote. That excludes African Americans, Native Americans, women, and basically anyone who is under 21, right? Now we're going to talk about some of this change, because it does change. And so the 14th Amendment changes who is considered a citizen. And this is important because citizens have the right to vote. It's one of our American rights as a citizen, is it to be able to vote. So it says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So not only are you a citizen of the U.S., but also the state you live, which is also important if you remember federalism, right? You vote on people for your state, but you can also vote on people for the federal government. So that is important. At this point in time, slavery is banned for the 14th Amendment, and this amendment allowed African Americans to be citizens of the United States. So the 14th Amendment gives African Americans the right to be citizens of the United States. One benefit for male citizens is the right to vote. However, it takes another amendment to extend voting rights to African Americans. So just because we have the 14th Amendment granting citizenship, we have to have another amendment to essentially give African Americans the right to vote. Okay? So, for this lesson, to understand popular sovereignty and its change over time, we're going to talk about 5 amendments. We're going to call them 5 suffrage amendments. And suffrage, if you don't know, refers to the right to vote. Okay? The first one is the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment gave voting rights to African Americans. Okay? So we got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Those amendments are considered the slavery amendments. And the 15th gave voting rights to African Americans. Then, in the early 1900s, we get the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment gives voting rights to women. The 23rd Amendment is unique because most of Americans and most of my students never even considered Washington, D.C. But since they were not a state, they were a district, they were kind of denied voting rights in certain elections because they lived in D.C. They're not one of the states. So the 23rd Amendment gives voting rights to citizens or residents of Washington, D.C. The 24th Amendment made it illegal to charge a poll tax in order to vote. And if you really start to think about this, this is key because it's sort of a way, part of an extension to prevent African Americans the right to vote, because the way this worked is in order to vote, certain polling places would charge money, a tax. And so if you can imagine people in extreme poverty at this time, on the heels of the Civil War and many decades after, African Americans are often in that extreme poverty category. And so it was a way to deny them a right to vote. And also, again, extreme poverty. So in the South specifically, you have these elites, the plantation class, if you will, that they were used to basically having all the power. And so one way that their power and wealth, they kind of kept a hold of it, was to make this poll tax, so that only your better off, or people with money who could afford that poll tax, would vote. And lastly, the 26th Amendment, which is most closely related to you guys right now, lowers the voting age to 18. They lowered the voting age to 18. After all, think about it. If you're going to be told that you have to go fight and risk your life in a war, shouldn't you at least get the chance to vote on the president or vote on the person who's going to send you there? Our next step in our journey through the changes to popular sovereignty is to look at any Supreme Court cases or events or other government decisions that affected this outcome, this concept of popular sovereignty. So we know what the Founding Fathers said, right? Three things must be in place for a true republic to exist. We know what the Constitution says. 21-year-old males are allowed to vote. We know what the amendments were, how they changed, how the definition of popular sovereignty changed in the Constitution over time. But now we're going to talk about some more hard-to-picture concepts about popular sovereignty, about populations and people. Okay? So, two main cases show up. The first one is Baker versus Carr. And we're going to go into more detail about Baker versus Carr because I really like it. It's a concept that's hard to grasp, but it does make sense. It's fair and equal. It's something that equalizes the vote. And we're also going to talk about Reynolds versus Sims. So, in Baker versus Carr, I don't remember which state or wherever this was, but representatives are chosen based on districts. Okay, so they set up districts and representatives were chosen. States were allowed to choose the boundaries of these districts. So basically, the state got to decide what area the district was made up of. The problem was that states would kind of use their voter data and know the populations that lived in these areas, and they would draw the boundaries in an attempt to split apart locations where many voters lived who were against maybe a political party in power. So basically, they were splitting it up in order to limit the power of their opponents, if you will. Oftentimes, locations with many minorities were split apart. Thus, it diluted their vote, okay? So specifically targeting people based on certain political information or political data about them, essentially denying them a right to vote. Reynolds versus Sims. I also like this case a lot. So, in Reynolds versus Sims, we have a case specifically in Alabama where each county was allowed to have one representative in the state Senate. Each county. So their regions were based on county, their districts, if you will. Now, I don't know how many counties there are in Alabama, and that doesn't really matter. What you got to think about, though, is that each problem is not equally populated, okay? Thus, the largest county, maybe a population of 500,000, would have the same power in the government as the smallest county, maybe one with 6,000. Now, let's break this down to Ohio terms because that's where we live in, something we might understand. Do you guys have a rough idea of what the population of Hardin County is?
It'd be small.
Roughly 30,000, okay? Do you know the population maybe of Franklin County, where Columbus lies?
40,000.
I would say 400,000.
I don't know what it is either, but I can tell you it's in the hundreds of thousands, right? And so if you think about the math here, in Alabama, one county got one representative, regardless of how many people lived in that county. So now let's do some math. If there's one representative for, 6,000 people, that representative only represents 6,000 people. But if you go to a larger county, or a county with more population, or a county that has a city in it, that one representative might represent 300,000 people. And 1 for 300,000 is not equal to 1 for 3,000. So not only did popular sovereignty mean the people must choose the power, but it kind of extends to the people's power must be equal or close to equal. Meaning all people must sort of have an equal representation of power. And that is key. Okay? In this case, the federal government ruled that the districts must be drawn so that they each contain a similar population. That their justification was that the people of Jefferson County were not getting a full benefit of equal representation, and the smaller populations were gaining greater power proportionally. So basically, the smaller counties had more power proportionally than the state, like big cities. And now again, if you kind of think about what you know about cities, and maybe even cities in the South, so you have great African American populations that live close to the cities. And so you're almost diluting the African American vote again. Okay, and we don't want that. We want equal voting power. We want the people to represent and function as the same. Basically, want people to be equal. All right, real quick before we move on, we'll do an ed puzzle, and this ed puzzle will be something we'll kick off on our next day, and I'll try to make this ed puzzle available on the video as well. So that's it.